My name is Hassan, and for many, many years, I truly believed that I knew God. I don't mean this in a symbolic sense, nor do I mean a distant or occasional faith. I mean a conviction that shaped every beat of my heart, every step I took. From an early age, I was immersed in the tradition of Islam, not as a choice, but as the very fabric of my existence. I was born into a home where the call to prayer echoed like the soundtrack of daily life, where the aroma of tea mingled with the verses of the Quran that my father solemnly recited in the evenings. I didn't just practice Islam, I embodied it. It was like breathing, automatic, essential. I grew up among the columns of a mosque where the whispers of prayer seemed to lull the soul. When I came of age, I became an imam, a spiritual guide, a leader. Not out of vanity, but because I deeply believed that this was my calling. I recited the Quran with reverence, counseled couples in distress, instructed young people to fear and love God. In the eyes of the community, I was a beacon, a man of faith, of wisdom, of discipline. I clearly remember the early mornings when I would get up before the sun just to purify myself and pray, even in the bitter cold. The sacred words flowed from my lips naturally. I had memorized them as if I had engraved them in my heart. When someone had doubts, they would come to me. When a young person felt lost, I would show them the way. When a Christian said that Jesus was God, I would respond with patience, respect, but also with firmness. To me, that was a mistake, a heresy. Jesus, yes, was a prophet, great, beloved, but never divine. It was my duty to protect the truth of monotheism, to guard the purity of Tawhid. I never imagined that I could be wrong. Not for a second. And why? My life was moral, clean. I fasted during Ramadan zealously. I gave part of my income to the needy. I avoided excesses, vices, arrogance. I felt at peace with my choices. I felt protected. The respect of others, the silence of prayers, the weight of the words of the Quran, all of this reinforced my certainty that I was on the right path. And for decades, this was enough for me. I never questioned. I never doubted. Because in my mind, I didn't just serve God. I knew Him. I felt intimate with Him, almost certain of His approval. But life has its own ways of bending us. I grew older. My hair, darkened by time, turned gray. My legs, once steady during long moments of prayer, began to tremble. My steps no longer had the same firmness as before. At first, it was just a strange tiredness, a fatigue that did not go away even after rest. Then came the pains, persistent, silent, accumulated. Medical examinations became more frequent. The doctor's words were more worrying. Progressive decline, slow organ failure, chronic condition. Yet I was not afraid. My heart said this is only a trial. And I, who had so often told others that God tests the righteous, repeated it to myself with force. I would endure. I would fast. I would pray. I would endure, as I had always done. But my body, oh, my body gave up before my faith did. My strength grew weaker. The nights grew too long. The fevers came like tides, sapping my strength. My prayers, once full of voice, were now whispers. And still I held on. Deep down, I believed that God was watching me and would eventually restore me. I thought, this is just another test. It will pass. But something changed. And it wasn't in my body, it was in my soul. As the days dragged on inside that hospital room, the silence grew. Not the silence from outside, but the silence from within. That unshakable certainty that had accompanied me throughout my life, it began to fade. And for the first time, without meaning to, without planning to, a question arose in my heart. Not out loud, not as a rebellious doubt, but as an uncomfortable whisper. What if I'm wrong? Not about everything, but about what matters most. I tried to push that thought away. I fought it like an evil temptation, but it came back, in the dark, among the beeping machines and the murmuring nurses' names. In the heat of the fever, in the silence of the sleepless nights, it was as if something was slowly being ripped away from me, the illusion of certainty. And then, it happened. There was no great warning, no heavenly flash, no voices from the heavens. It was simply put, the end. My breathing became shallow. The sounds around me began to fade, as if the world were moving away from me. The machines stopped beeping. The faces dissolved. And then silence, total. There was no light, no darkness. There was no ground, no sky, but there was awareness. Strangely, I was still awake. I knew my body was there, still cold, but I was no longer in it. It was like being suspended outside of time, floating within a reality that did not obey the rules I knew. I tried to understand. I tried to pray. I tried to invoke the verses that had so long been my shelter. But there was no mouth. There was no voice. Yet my mind was intact. I was Hassan. I remembered everything, but nothing was the same. And it was in this place, this space where the world had ceased, that the real journey began. And then, the moment arrived. It was like stepping through an invisible veil. The transition was subtle but irreversible. Suddenly I could see everything, not with the eyes of my body but with something beyond. A consciousness that seemed wider, more awake than it had ever been in life. I looked down and there it was, my body, inert, fragile, pale, lying on the hospital bed surrounded by machines that now emitted a deathly silence. The lights that had once twinkled like artificial stars had stopped. The screens showed flat lines, no sound, no heartbeat. I saw nurses rush in. One of them, desperate, pressed her shaking hands against my chest. The other was shouting something, her eyes wide with panic, but I was above, literally above, hovering, watching everything with a strange serenity, as if the urgency of this moment no longer concerned me. There was no fear, there was no attachment. It was as if the part of me that had always fought for control had simply accepted, it's over. But it wasn't an end. It was the beginning of something I could never have predicted. I felt something pulling me, not violently. It wasn't like being pulled, but as if I had been gently caught in an invisible current pulling me purposefully. I didn't fight it. I didn't know how. It was like every fiber of my soul knew I had to go. There were no walls, no floor, no sky, just space. A space that was formless but incredibly dense. There was silence, yes, but a silence that wasn't empty. It was a silence that was charged, alive, filled with something I couldn't name, but it filled everything. In my mind, I imagined that if death were real, and I had always believed it was, I would be greeted by familiar voices. Maybe my father. Maybe angels like the ones described in the hadiths. Maybe something sacred in line with everything I'd been taught. But what I found was nothing like anything I had ever imagined. As the hospital disappeared like mist in the sunlight, I felt a presence. Not a visible figure, not a physical form, but someone was there, waiting. And in that instant, a chill ran through my consciousness, not of fear, but of awe. I was standing before something or someone, greater than anything my theological knowledge had grasped. A holiness so pure, so immense that I felt naked, not physically but totally exposed, as if every thought, every intention, every moment of pride and doubt was brought to the surface. I looked at my body again. It felt strange, distant, like it no longer belonged to me. The familiar features of my face were there, but something was missing. The spark, the life. And even as nurses rushed around the body, trying to resuscitate it, I knew this was no longer me. And it was there that reality hit me with silent force. I had died. There was no room for doubt. I was not asleep. I was not in a trance. I was not experiencing a symbolic vision. I had truly crossed the boundary between the earthly and the eternal. And to my surprise, this revelation did not fill me with panic as I had always imagined. On the contrary, it silenced me. It broke me. It bent me inside. Everything I had been, the leader, the imam, the teacher, the defender of the faith, now seemed like a distant echo. A role I had played on a stage whose scenery had completely disappeared. Time there was not the same. It did not move. It did not wait. It just was. Everything happened at once, as if the past, the present, and the future were collapsed into a single point. And the more I was carried by that invisible current, the more I felt something awaken inside me. Something that, until then, had always been dormant. It was a certainty. This was just the beginning, not an end, not a conclusion, but an introduction to a reality for which I had never been prepared. And then there, in that abyss full of presence, I felt. I didn't see, I felt someone was watching me. Someone whose purity was so intense that I felt like dust in comparison. It wasn't an immediate judgment, it wasn't a punishment, but it was a direct confrontation with truth. A truth so luminous, so pure, that my soul by reflex wanted to hide. As if instinctively I knew that I could never justify myself before that presence. I thought, where are the gardens? Where is the peaceful paradise that my devotion promised me? Where are the angels with serene faces and white robes? But none of that was there. Instead, I was drawn to a place that shattered every image my mind had built up over all those years of teaching and faith. The force pulling me wasn't harsh, but it was immensely powerful, as if the universe itself had bent on moving me. And as it was pulled farther than any words could reach, everything familiar disappeared. The hospital room, the voices, the body. None of it mattered anymore. Everything was changing. And I, Hassan, who had preached so much about what came after death, now discovered with my own soul's eyes that nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what was to come. I didn't float to heaven. I didn't pass through fluffy clouds or see golden gates in the distance. Instead, the material world dissolved like smoke blown away by the wind. Everything familiar, time, space, sound, weight ceased to exist. And then I entered. I entered a realm hidden behind the veil of reality, as if all my life I had only been skimming the surface of a much greater mystery. There was no ground beneath my feet, no sky above my head. Yet I existed. I was awake, more awake than I had ever been. The space around me was a paradox, at once empty and full, quiet and thunderous, dark and filled with an invisible light. And in the center of this formless space I felt. I did not hear. I did not see. I felt a presence. Not as an idea, not as a religious or emotional concept. It was real, conscious, personal. It was as if an invisible light touched my soul, but not gently. It pressed. It cut through me. Every hidden thought, every secret pride, every unresolved wound was brought to the surface under that invisible gaze. There was no immediate judgment, but there was no escape either. I was seen, totally, whole, and yet held. The presence knew me, not just my actions, but the motivations behind them. It knew my silent fears, my sins that I dared not even name, my prayers that sounded strong on the outside but came from a heart that was sometimes empty, and this presence did not withdraw. It remained, steadfast, alive, hot as fire, pure as light, heavy as glory, sacred. At that moment, a terrible truth dawned on me. I had spent my life talking about God, seeking God, defending God, without ever having stood before Him. The revelation shattered me. I, the Imam, the teacher, the guide. I, who had studied every verse, who had corrected others, who had dedicated my life to religious righteousness. I stood before Him for the first time, and I realized that I had never really known Him. I had known ideas, doctrines, systems, but not Him. And then, when I thought the impact of that presence could not be greater, the environment changed again. The silence grew denser, as if the entire universe had held its breath. The atmosphere, previously filled only with truth, was suddenly invaded by something even stronger, brighter, more guys. And it was then that I saw Him. At first, I didn't understand what was before me. It was light, but not cold light. It was radiant, golden, alive. It moved with purpose, with intent. It didn't just illuminate, revealed. And from the center of that light, a figure began to emerge. Didn't walk, didn't float. It simply was. As if the universe were slowly revealing its shape with reverence. As its contours became clear, I understood that this was no symbolic vision. I was standing before someone real, alive, sovereign. It was a man, but no ordinary man. He was clothed in purity, not as a cloth, but as a part of his very being. The light that surrounded him seemed to bow before him. It was as if all creation knew who he was, and I knew. Before any name was even said, I knew. That man was Jesus, but not the Jesus of theological comparisons, nor the prophet of my tradition, nor the name repeated in interfaith conversations. This was the living Christ, glorified, resplendent, surrounded by such absolute holiness that my soul began to tremble. He did not speak, but his eyes pierced me like a sword and a balm at the same time. They were eyes that not only saw and knew, within them was eternity, within them was justice, but there was also mercy. A love so fierce, so immense, so absolute, that for a moment I thought I could not bear it, that I would be crushed by the very weight of that presence. But I didn't go, because along with glory came an indescribable grace, a peace that was not fragile but firm, a certainty that needed no explanation. Jesus looked at me, not with contempt, not with distance, but with love that burned, love that purified, love that transformed. And in that moment, my entire belief system, all my carefully constructed theology, all the pride I had carried in leading others, collapsed, because I finally saw, truth was not a concept, truth was a person, and she was standing before me. I knew immediately who he was, not because someone told me, not because of a picture, a logical argument, or an intellectual revelation. I knew because my soul recognized him. It was as if a truth buried beneath layers of doctrine, pride, and religious striving finally awakened, not gently but like a lightning bolt that splits the sky of the soul and reveals everything at once. I knew him, not with my mind, with my spirit, with a part of me that had never had a voice until now. My first reaction was to look away, not because he was grotesque or threatening, but because his holiness exposed me in a way that was impossible to bear. I could not bear the weight of his presence with my eyes. It was like standing naked before eternity itself. I wanted to hide. I wanted to shrink away, disappear, retreat to the comfort of ignorance. But there was nowhere to go, because the truth was before me, and I was within it. This was not a prophet. This was not a wise man, an enlightened teacher, one guide among many. This was Jesus. The name that I had so often spoken with academic respect, with calculated reverence, was now fire. It was life, and he did not stand before me as a distant character in an alien narrative. He was present, glorified, alive, and my soul, upon seeing him, fell to its knees. even though my body had no ground to do so. Confusion was the first human emotion that ran through me. How was this possible? How could the very foundation of everything I had believed, taught, stood for be wrong? How could someone I had always honored as a prophet now appear before me not as a messenger but as an origin, as a source, as a God? My mind tried to resist. The old man within me erected the doctrinal walls I had lived with for so many years. Quotes, verses, rebuttals. They all came crashing down on me like a wall trying to hold back a flood. But no words came to my mouth. No defense made sense there. Because before him theology fell silent. Dogma dissolved. And pride died. Jesus did not speak immediately. He just looked at me. And in that look I felt surrender beginning. Not a forced surrender, but the kind that only truth can generate. Because truth does not impose, it reveals. And when it is revealed, there is no more reason to fight. He didn't accuse me. He didn't mock. He didn't say you were wrong. He just looked, with eyes that burned with compassion and justice in equal measure. And I knew he knew me. I knew he had been waiting, that he had been coming for me not just in that moment but all my life. And then he spoke. His voice was not sound as we know it. It was pure vibration. It was light that became words. It was sacred breath that penetrated every corner of my soul. It was not loud, but it filled everything, as if the universe itself was bending down to hear him. You have known part of the truth, he said, but now I will show you all. These words were not heard. They were absorbed. They pierced me as if they had been made for me before I even existed. And with them, my entire story opened up before me, not as an accusation, but as a revelation. I saw every prayer I prayed with sincerity but without direction. I saw every teaching I delivered with zeal but without life. I saw the faces of the people who prayed with me, who trusted me, who sought God through the words I spoke, and I realized that even the right words without the right person could be shortcuts to nothing. Not that everything I had experienced was a lie, but it was incomplete. It was a shadow, a reflection, an echo. I had walked a path that touched the sacred, but I had never known it, the source. And now before me, Jesus was not pointing me the way to God. He was the way. He was God himself. Revelation broke me inside. But along with the pain of the fall came something unexpected, grace. He didn't look at me with disappointment, nor with coldness. He looked at me like someone who had waited patiently, like someone who had always known me, like someone who sought me out even when I cried out against him. Part of me still struggled. The old structure still clung to the need for logic, for explanation, for consistency with everything it had taught. How could it be him? How could this man I had called a prophet be here now in eternal glory, revealing himself as God himself? But he didn't expect my questions. He knew them. And more than that, he understood me. Not with condescension, but with patient love. Everlasting love. I began to weep. Not with physical tears, but with tears of the soul. A deep sadness came over me. Sorrow for the wasted years, for the wrong paths, for the sermons that led men to religion but not to the Savior. Sorrow that I had been so near the truth and yet so far from it. But in the midst of this sadness came joy. An absurd, almost unbearable joy. Because in spite of everything, I was there, and he received me. Jesus did not approach with footsteps. His light, his presence filled me, as if the distance between us was dissolved by himself. It was no longer just something external. It was interior. He invaded me, not with force, but with love. And in that moment I understood. He was not just showing me what I had been. He was beginning to make myself. He was everything. The truth I sought, the light I lacked, the God my heart longed to know even when my mind denied him. And there before him for the first time, I began to live. He didn't condemn me, but he didn't excuse me either. His holiness was absolute, and so he had no need to raise his voice or make accusations. He simply era. And this reality exposed everything inside me with such intense clarity that it was painful, yet not cruel. It was pure pain, holy pain, like a blade that cuts with precision, not to hurt, but to heal. You were sincere, he said. But sincerity without truth is still lost, and you were lost, Hassan. When he spoke my name, it was not as others had done, not as my mother had called me in affection, or as the disciples had greeted me with respect. There was a frightening intimacy in that word, as if he had known me before I existed, as if every hair on my head, every hidden thought, every whispered prayer had been accompanied by him all along. At that moment, a profound conviction struck me. Jesus not only knew who I was, he always knew, and he always waited. He waited for me in the days when I believed I was closest to God. He waited in every rigorous fast, in every verse of the Quran that I recited with fervor, in every sincere tear that I shed in search of a presence that never seemed to touch me completely. The tears began to fall, not out of fear, but out of truth. A truth that stripped me bare inside but didn't shame me because it was beautiful, pure, liberating, like I was breathing for the first time. I didn't yet know what he would show me next, but for the first time, I was ready. The moment Jesus said, "I will show you everything," the scene around me began to dissolve once more, but this time not into darkness, not into silence. What surrounded me now was something more intimate, the memory. It wasn't like watching an old movie or revisiting hazy memories. No, it was living experiences, intense in colors more vivid than any reality I had ever known. I was inside them, but with new eyes, with new understanding. I didn't just see what I did, I saw because I did. And that changed everything. Contrary to what I feared, I was not led to see hidden scandals or sensationalized sins. What emerged before me were the very parts of myself that I was most proud of, the pillars of my identity, the showcase of my spiritual life, my passionate sermons, my eloquent prayers before the community, my early mornings awake, reciting the Quran with devotion, my firm leadership in the mosque, advice given to young people, my fast during Ramadan, the corrections I made to those who deviated from orthodoxy. These were the acts that I believed I had accumulated before God as merits, the things that justified my standing, the things that validated my spiritual existence. But as these scenes unfolded, something in me began to crumble, not because of what I had done, but because of what I had done. Reason with what I did. Jesus did not speak. He did not correct with words. His look said it all. It was as if his presence revealed layers that I had never dared to probe, layers that I didn't even know existed. I had always believed my intentions were pure, but now I saw them in a different light. I began to see that there was pride disguised as zeal, that there was fear disguised as reverence, that there was control disguised as leadership. I saw myself preaching eloquently, but deep down I needed to be seen as someone with answers. It was more about validate my identity as an imam than to lead others to the heart of God. I saw the prayers spoken loudly, full of authority, but behind them there was a deep insecurity. The fear of not appearing strong, of being questioned, of losing respect. I saw with pain that my life of devotion was many times motivated more by fear of shamet than by longing for love. I performed rituals, yes, I fasted, I taught, but there was a hidden desperation within me to maintain the appearance of holiness, even if it took me further away from God instead of closer to Him. And then, perhaps most painful of all, I found myself praying alone, kneeling in the dark, my forehead pressed against the carpet, the verses of the Quran flowing like an ancient melody. And there, without Jesus saying a word, I learned that even those disciplined prayers were often empty of relationship. They were based on fear, but not the holy fear that brings people together. It was fear of damnation, fear of hell, fear of not being enough. I knew the name of God, but I didn't know God. And there, in the midst of those revelations, Jesus stood, not with an air of disapproval, but with the patience of one who had loved me through all those years of well-intentioned ignorance. His presence was the truth, and that truth transformed me without him needing to say anything else. It was then that I began to realize that grace does not manifest itself only when we fall into visible sins. Sometimes it comes to break the foundations of our self-righteousness, and only when all of that falls apart is there room for us to let real life begin. My whole life had been shaped by the fear of being wrong, not out of love for the truth, not out of a burning desire to know God intimately, but out of the quiet terror of discovering that everything I believed might be built on sand. So I clung tooth and nail to what I had been taught. I memorized it, I repeated it. I taught it with conviction, not because I had found fulfillment, but because I feared emptiness. I didn't question it. I did not kneel in silence and ask God, "Do I really know you?" I did not seek him deeply. I recited him. I assumed that because I followed rules, prayed more than others, practiced rituals rigorously, lived with more outward purity than those around me, I was safe. I thought my zeal was synonymous with salvation. I thought my fidelity to form was evidence of a changed heart. I didn't know, but I was further from it than I had ever been. Jesus, with tenderness that pierced my soul, began to lead me through memories that I had dismissed as irrelevant, almost invisible moments, forgotten conversations, small seeds that had been planted by Christians who crossed my path, simple words, brief testimonies. Some spoke to me about Jesus, not only as a prophet but as a savior, as God. I listened to them with a polite smile but with a sealed heart. I felt superior. I had arguments, I had doctrine. I didn't ridicule them. He disregarded. He had already decided they were wrong before they even opened their mouths. Not because I was sure of the truth, but because I feared what would happen if I questioned mine. And then came the most uncomfortable revelation, how I reacted to doubt. When doubt whispered in my soul, I silenced it. I buried it under recitations, fasts, rules, leadership. And when I saw doubt in the eyes of others, when young people came to me with sincere questions, with dilemmas that deserved love. I did not offer depth. I offered formulas. I redirected. I repeated doctrines as shields, not out of malice, but because I myself was afraid. Fear of appearing weak, fear of being unmasked, fear of discovering that my reputation was more sacred to me than the truth itself. Jesus showed me the faces of these people, not as condemnation but as a mirror. People who trusted me. Some were broken, some were hungry for meaning, and I brought them into the ritual, into the structure, into the duty, but not for the heart of God. I wasn't cruel, I just didn't have what they needed most. I wasn't walking with God. I walked around him, I spoke about him, even with passion. But his real living, transforming presence was something I had never heard of. It was close to the language of faith, but far from the relationship he had always wanted with me. And instead of crushing me, this revelation brought me something unexpected. Sadness, a holy sadness, deep, a sadness that did not come from shame but from light, a sadness that cleansed like tears that washed the eyes and allowed the soul to see. I finally understood that Jesus wasn't humiliating me. He was setting me free of lies I didn't even know I believed, lies disguised as zeal, lies dressed as pity. Then came the softest and strongest blow of all. He showed me how many times God reached out to me and I didn't realize it. Moments that seemed insignificant, an awkward silence after prayer, a restlessness in my heart when listening to a Christian song of praise, a dream that carried too much light, a brief chill when hearing the name of Jesus spoken with love, a simple believer with shining eyes telling me that God loved him, little glimpses, touches from heaven, and I suppressed them, I ignored them, I dismissed them as distractions. I told myself, stand firm, don't question, don't deviate, but he was there, nearby, waiting, and I didn't realize. You have been sincere, Jesus repeated, but you are still far away because of fear. Tradition and identity cannot bring you to the Father. Only I can. Those words felt like an earthquake and a balm at the same time. Everything I thought I knew collapsed, but not violently. It collapsed silently, like an old house that finally gives way, not to a gale but to time, because it was never built on the rock. And there I was, undone, but not without hope. For the first time I saw the emptiness inside me. Not an emptiness of knowledge, but an emptiness in my soul. I didn't need any more rules, any more memorized verses, any more explanations. I needed him, simply his. Jesus did not speak like religious teachers spoke. He did not lecture me. He did not present arguments. He just revealed, and each revelation was vivid, burning, impossible to deny. Then the scene around us began to change, but not through movement, but through understanding. It was as if my spirit was being transported, not through a physical space, but to a new level of reality. One moment I was standing before him, eyes wet, heart in ruins, and the next moment, I was standing before something I had never really considered. A cruise, not a wooden symbol, not a decorative piece, not a theological error of Christians, not a heresy as I was taught, mass deepest reality in human history. The cross, which I had discarded all my life, awaited me like an eternal invitation. The cross, it was no longer distant, no longer symbolic. It was alive before me, not just an object or a historical event, but an eternal, pulsating, present reality. I saw it not with the eyes of the body, but with the eyes of the spirit, as if I had been transported into the very heart of God. What had once been a mystery was now being unveiled before me in layers that pierced my soul. It was no longer just a plank of blood-stained wood, but the throne of the Lamb, the altar where the impossible became possible. There Jesus did not look defeated. He was not weak. Even in his pain, even covered in blood, even suspended by nails, there was glory in every gesture, in every breath. The purest, most overwhelming love I have ever witnessed came not from a word or a miracle, but from that moment when he refused to come down. He could have, I knew he could have, but he chose to stay for me. And I felt, not just observed, but sensed what was upon him. My unbelief, my spiritual pride, my empty theology, my proud sermons, my cold holy nights. It was all there, along with the sins of the whole world. And yet he did not look away. He took them. He loved them. He loved me. In that moment, I realized that my greatest tragedy had not been theological error, but distance. The distance between me and the true God. I had served him from a distance, praised him out of obligation, feared him more than loved him. And there he was on the cross, not shouting condemnation, but offering reconciliation. The cross was not the end. It was the way back home. The glory of the cross was not in its brutality, but in its surrender. Jesus was not defeated. He surrendered. Not out of weakness, but out of strength, out of compassion. The blood that flowed was not a symbol of defeat, but of victory. Every drop was a voluntary act of eternal love. Grace, he said, not in an audible voice, but in a way that filled my core. I didn't have to earn it. I just had to believe. For the first time in my life, I understood what that meant. This wasn't a religious transaction. It was a divine embrace. It was as if heaven itself had reached down to me and said, "No more trying to save yourself. I've come for you." His love did not ignore me. It transformed me. I, who had once sought to justify myself by works, now saw clearly. No amount of good deeds, no amount of fidelity to tradition, no amount of spiritual leadership could pay the debt of my soul. Salvation was a gift, undeserved, scandalous, free, and yet profoundly just, because the price had been paid. Jesus looked at me, and in that look there was everything: mercy, truth, redemption. There was no longer any need to run away or wear masks. For the first time, I could rest. My heart, accustomed to hiding behind sacred texts, was now naked before the one who is the Word himself. And he did not destroy me. He healed me. At the cross, I realized that everything I had thought was central, ritual, purity, orthodoxy, reputation, was only a shadow. The cross was the substance. It was where the veil was torn. It was where the distance between the Holy One and the sinner was abolished. It was where God became man so that man might finally know God. And in the silence that followed the vision, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. There was no going back to the old life, because now finally I had found life. But perfect love casts out fear. This phrase echoed within me like a gentle thunder, like a wave of truth that came not to drown, but to purify. This was what I was experiencing. Not a theoretical love, not a concept of mercy, but the living manifestation of love that does not demand merit, that does not expect perfection, that simply comes, enters, transforms, liberates. Jesus' presence didn't accuse me. It disarmed me. One by one, the bricks of the fortress I had built around my soul fell away. My theology, my tradition, my reputation, my sincerity, everything I had used to prove my worth. None of it was enough to bridge the gap between me and the Father. And yet, He was there, not waiting for me to fix it, but offering me rest. He didn't want my performance. He wanted my heart. As I gazed upon the images He had shown me, the earnest multitudes, the fearful leaders, the silent seekers, something in me tore itself apart. A new grief, deeper, more honest than all that had come before. Not the grief of disappointment, not the grief of shame. It was the grief of compassion. For the first time, I wept not just for myself, but for everyone. For all who, like me, had tried so hard to please God, and yet were so far from knowing Him. What had been pride was now lamentation. What had been zeal was now crying out for the lost, not the lost out there, as I used to say in my sermons, but the lost within of the religious structures themselves. I realized that sincerity is not enough, because if sincerity were the criterion for salvation, then we would not need the cross. But it was precisely out of love for all of us, whether sincere or not, that the cross was necessary. Jesus' truth did not despise my story. It redeemed it. And it also redeemed the story of all those who were searching, stumbling, sacrificing themselves with tears in their eyes and heavy hearts. Sincerity could take us to the threshold of truth, but only the blood of Christ could get us across to the other side. "You have sought me earnestly," Jesus said with tenderness that crushed the remaining defenses of my heart. "But now I call you to follow me in truth." At that moment, I understood that the gospel is not just a message for the ignorant or the flagrant sinners. It is for everyone, for the religious, for the pious, for the learned, for those who fast and pray and kneel, for those who live within the walls of tradition, trying to make sense of a system that cannot save. And I was one of them. I was the one Jesus was seeking. With tears in my eyes, I remembered the young men who had prayed with me in the mosque, the women who had come to me with doubts and pain, the old men who had thanked me for a sermon that I now knew was incomplete. They were not my followers. They were sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus was the good shepherd. My heart broke all over again, because I realized that the same grace that reached me there in that sacred revelation was the same grace He wanted to extend to everyone, even the most devout, even the most sincere, especially them. Everything in me now cried out, "Lord, take me back, not to the old religion, but to those who still live in it, that they may see what I have seen, that they may know what I now know." And He answered, not with words, but with that look that said, "This is what I have called you to." Because truth sets you free, grace transforms, and love casts out all fear. But to my surprise, the judgment I expected did not come in the form of wrath. It did not come as condemnation or rebuke. What I felt there, exposed before the absolute holiness of the Father, was something that no human language can contain. It was justice and mercy coexisting. It was absolute truth without annihilation. It was light so intense that nothing in me could be hidden, but at the same time it did not destroy me, because Jesus was there. He stood between me and the Father, not as an obstacle but as the mediator, as the one who had already borne all that my soul should have borne. In that moment, I understood something even more profound than anything that had been revealed to me before. Jesus did not merely die for me, He intercedes for me. He is my eternal intercessor. And that is why I have been able to stand before the holiness of God without being consumed. The words of Hebrews came alive in my soul. We have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. It was true. He did. He knew every failed attempt, every blind zeal, every fear-driven obedience, and yet He stood before the Father as the one who paid, the one who loved, the one who saved. There was nothing left in me that could resist. My soul, once built on layers of tradition, conviction, culture, and theology, now stood naked before the Creator. And yet, I was loved. The Father didn't speak in audible words, but His presence said it all. He knew me. He had always known me. And even when I had walked crooked paths, even when I had used His name without knowing Him, He loved me. I saw for an instant my entire life through His eyes, not with contempt, but with a sadness filled with love. He didn't just want my obedience. He wanted my heart. And now my heart finally belonged to Him. I felt Jesus move beside me, not physically, but as a living presence. And He showed me something else. I saw faces, countless faces, generations and generations of people. Some I had known, some I had never seen, but each one with eyes hungry for God. Some were trapped in religions, some lost in philosophies, some in churches, but without knowing the true gospel. And Jesus said, "These are the ones I died for too. It is not enough that you have known the truth. Now you must live it. You must proclaim it. You must go." It was a calling, a commissioning, a sending. I, a former Imam, a man shaped by tradition and sincerity, was now called not to deny my history, but to redeem it through the witness of the Son. The truth had not destroyed me. It had set me free. And now that same truth needed to reach others, especially those who, like me, thought they were right, but were simply sincerely lost. I looked back at the Father. Holiness was still unbearably beautiful, but now because of Jesus it was also welcoming. For the first time I understood what it meant to have peace with God. It wasn't the absence of conflict, it was reconciliation. It was belonging. And there in that sacred moment I knew I would never be the same again. The cross had shown me the price. Grace had given me new life. The Father had received me. And now the world needed to hear it, not more religion, not more human effort, but the gospel, pure, powerful, sufficient. Jesus didn't just save me, He sent me. I found myself in a place where the physical no longer made sense. There was no body, no form, no tangible presence like we know in this world. But deep within my soul, something happened that was more real than anything I had ever experienced. It was as if my entire being was bending, not from an external force, but from a deep, inescapable internal recognition. I was standing before something immensely greater than myself, a glory so pure and overwhelming that I could barely maintain my own awareness without being crushed by it. There was no sound, there was no movement, but I felt as if every fiber of my being was surrendering. My mind was trying to prepare itself for the inevitable, the anger, the rebuke, the condemnation. Because who was I to be here? I, who had carried so much pride, so much certainty, so many failures, so many doubts. I, who had spent my life trying to achieve justice through my own hands, through my own efforts, and who now knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that none of it was enough. And then something completely unexpected happened. In the midst of that light that illuminated and revealed everything, a feeling deeper than any earthly love took hold of me. It was not that soft and empty love that many speak of, nor a mere superficial kindness. It was a sacred love, a truly heavy love, that did not run away from my weaknesses, but embraced them with a tenderness that made me tremble. Not with fear, but with a reverent respect, with a profound humility that I had never known before. This love did not ignore my unworthiness. On the contrary, it acknowledged it completely, as if to say, I see who you are, but I do not turn away. I accept you just the way you are. It was a holiness that did not punish but welcomed, that did not reject but restored. And this holiness, so absolute and pure, was the same holiness that showed me every flaw, every imperfection, every fear hidden within my heart. It was then that, without a single word spoken aloud, a truth was communicated to me. It did not reach my ears, but the deepest essence of my spirit. The message was clear, definitive, impossible to deny. No one can come to the Father except through my Son. These words did not come from Jesus this time, but directly from the Father. They were not a warning nor a punishment. They were a revelation that tore apart all doubts, that crumbled all the internal barriers I had built throughout my life. There, in that moment of pure revelation, every defense, every justification, every argument I had ever used to deny Jesus' divinity or to reduce him to a mere prophet was destroyed. My mind not only understood, but my heart and soul fully accepted. Jesus was not simply one way among many. He is the way. The Father did not offer me an alternative route, nor a parallel path. He did not say, "Your efforts were good." He pointed to his Son, the bridge, the only access to true communion with God. In that instant, the invisible connection between Father and Son was revealed before my spiritual eyes, an eternal, inseparable unity that I had never perceived so clearly. I thought about all that I had experienced, all the time I had dedicated to my faith, my sincerity, my service, and I saw with painful clarity that none of these things could replace the absolute need for Christ. It was no longer a question of merit or of self-righteousness. It was a total surrender, a complete surrender to the one who had paid the price for me. In that encounter, as the light of the Father and the Son enveloped me, I felt something rare, a peace that surpassed understanding, a sense that despite everything I had been found, not as an adversary or a stranger, but as someone deeply loved and accepted. And that's when a new reality became clear to me. The path to God is not in traditions, in rituals, in the endless search for approval. It is in the living person of Jesus Christ. Every doubt I had carried, every fear of rejection, every burden I thought I needed to carry began to dissolve in that light. I no longer needed to try to prove my worth or seek salvation in my own strength. I just needed to accept that love, a love that not only accepted me but transformed me. The revelation of that moment became the anchor of my life. I finally understood that being found by God was not a prize given to the perfect, but a gift given to the broken, to those who recognize that they cannot walk alone. And so, in that sacred silence, with my heart open and my soul in awe, I left behind everything I thought I knew, and I surrendered myself to the only one who could truly save me, Jesus, the Son of the living God.